first speaker is Dan Irving. He's a doctoral candidate in the Department of English, working at the intersection of narrative theory, contemporary fiction, and cognitive science. His dissertation examines reading as a situated, embodied activity, specifically looking into the experience of presence in plotless and dialogue-based narratives. He has forthcoming articles in Poetics Today and Countertext. Dan.
All right, hey, so thanks for coming. This is cool. I want to thank Dr. Tabor for the opportunity to share some of my work here today. It's an honor as well to be the token humanist in this semester's lecture series, so that's kind of cool. So I'll do my best to make a good impression on the geneticists and the engineers. So with this in mind, I'm sometimes asked to explain what I do, what my dissertation is about. And in the simplest terms, I want to know how this, which is a short story by Lydia Davis, how this works, how a reader experiences this sort of text. This is a very short account of a person describing some potential issues in adopting his or her two grown nieces after their mother's death. The narrative itself is uneventful and, I argue, in many ways inconsequential. And while the story itself is boring, what we could call an instance of weak narrativity, the title sticks out. Oral history with hiccups. And there's the curious spacing up there as well, which is easily enough explainable as the spaces where the narrator hiccups. Now, what I'm suggesting here is that to read particular sorts of texts for meaning, which is what all of us from early on in our lives have been in a sense trained to do, is to miss the point entirely. Attention to meaning from both professional and everyday readers of fiction has just been way overblown, and the English department contingent here, I'm sorry. So instead, I think texts such as this should be read for presence, for the sense of being there in the world of the story. Language, in this and other cases, being used less to mean and more to move. Readers of this text aren't decoding some sort of meaning from a textual representation. We're not even really getting a representation of the hiccups. It's just spaces. But we do get that there are hiccups there. What we experience by reading this text is being in the presence of a hiccuping person. This is, I cannot stress this enough, really, really weird. And it's a woefully underexplored facet of reading. I'm going to revisit this point in a few minutes. I want to formally start my discussion by framing a problem, though. For much of its history, the field of narrative theory has held fast to a desire to come up with a way to seamlessly describe all narratives, fictional and non-fictional, popular and arcane, natural and experimental. And in order to accomplish this goal, in short, what happened was narrative theorists paid loads of attention to a specific sort of story, to mimetic narratives, or stories about relatively plausible, interesting scenarios, stories that tend to have a linear plot, realistic, developed characters, a proper beginning and ending, and so on. And these theorists were aware of other sorts of texts, of course, but they saw them as problematic, as non-narrative, and there was pushback against folks who attempted to study these experimental texts in a manner that questioned the existing, ostensibly all-encompassing theories of narrative. For instance, in a recent discussion of how he came to study the unusual and even impossible temporalities in experimental fiction, Brian Richardson, narrative scholar at the University of Maryland, recalls being told with disdain that these were mere anti-narratives. The clear implication was that narratology need not bother with such texts. So if it doesn't work within kind of the framework that these folks have set up, they say, well, that's not even a narrative, so it doesn't matter, that's not our thing. Richardson has since gone on to become a major figure in what's called unnatural narratology, or the study of texts depicting situations and events that move beyond, extend, challenge, or defy our knowledge of the world. And this includes stories told in reverse chronology, such as F. Scott Fitzgerald's Benjamin Button or Martin Amis's Time's Arrow. Stories told by non-human narrators, such as Franz Kafka's The Burrow, which is narrated by a little adorable mole-like creature. And stories whose setting defies the physics of the natural world, such as Mark Z. Danielewski's House of Leaves, set in a house that's far larger on the inside than on the outside. And about 10 years ago, Pekka Tami, a narrative theorist working in Finland, wrote an article condemning this desire for a theory that can account for all narratives, a desire that he saw as weakening the field. He argued that even if this is possible, a theory that unifies these really just vastly different types of narratives is going to collapse what's most distinctive and special about them. Tami instead urges us to study the subversive and strange, previously untheorized or insufficiently theorized cases, the glorious exceptions to the rules that classical definitions have been altogether too sweeping to recognize. Now, by this, he means stories that are boring, poorly constructed, pointless, and otherwise disturbing our notions of what narratives, of what stories should be. And my work builds on a rich tradition of inquiry into the experience of reading, and specifically reading the sorts of weird narratives that so intrigue folks like Richardson and Tami. And in recent years, this research has shifted from a representational third-person perspective towards an embodied first-person perspective. So whereas in the 1980s and into the 2000s, narrative scholars were considering how linguistic information in texts was essentially decoded and represented in the mind of the reader, much like a computer processes information inputted by a user, theorists have moved towards an understanding of reading as an embodied, situated activity. And these recent studies on reading are consistent with a movement within the cognitive sciences towards an embodied understanding of cognition, or the idea that cognitive processes aren't a brain-bound phenomenon, but involve the brain, body, and environment. And today, I want to talk about some strange sorts of stories that both narrative theory and cognitive studies have to this point been unable to really account for. The case study texts that I examine in this project can all be characterized as having weak narrativity, understood here as the authorial choice to tell a story poorly or distractedly. Weak narrativity texts are meandering, disjointed, and at best loosely plotted. They may not often fit one's typical definition of what a narrative is, may not encourage, in some cases actively discourage interpretation, and they may not seem to have much of an immediate point. They're the very sorts of texts that orthodox narratologists have historically been happy to disregard, and the very sorts of texts, kind of to the chagrin of many of my students, I'm most drawn to. Now, I should note that weak narrativity is a term that was initially used to discuss long works of avant-garde lyric poetry, which theorists long ago decided didn't qualify as narrative. But Brian McHale, a narrative scholar at Ohio State, who coined this term about 15 years ago, argues that some of these long lyric poems felt like narrative, even though they didn't kind of fit existing definitions of what a narrative actually is. So he said that these poems are narratives, but weak narratives. They're not as narrative as Great Expectations or Harry Potter or Huckleberry Finn are, but there's some semblance of a story there, so it's worth it for a narrative scholar to take in. And so McHale kind of defies convention here, not satisfied with an understanding of narrative that leaves out these complicated but compelling borderline cases. And now, just in the last couple of years, theorists focusing on prose narrative have begun adapting McHale's term, inspiring a push towards studying the meaningful disturbances, the charmingly problematic texts that have thus far gone understudied or misunderstood. Now, designating a text as having weak narrativity sets it in contrast to one with strong or high narrativity. Such texts are firmly plotted, end-oriented, and typically thought of as being well-told. This isn't a means of assessing how good a story is, just in what sense it feels like or resembles a prototypical narrative, though much of kind of the traditional canon of literature tends to be on the stronger end. Now, strong narrativity texts tend to function as a back and forth between presence effects, or the feeling of being there, and meaning effects, or the story, the argument, the bits of conceptual information being communicated to the reader. So while the reader may feel transported while reading these sorts of texts, may feel transported to Harlem while reading Invisible Man, the story itself and its accompanying meaning effects tends to take precedence. That's what readers tend to focus on. My argument here is that weak narrativity texts are fundamentally different sorts of projects, and thinking about them in the same terms or reading them with the same strategies, the same approach as texts with strong narrativity is more often than not to completely misread the work, to totally miss what makes these narratives just so damn awesome. Because in weak narrativity texts, the back and forth between meaning and presence effects is thrown off. The sense of presence comes to the forefront, utilizing the reader's embodied knowledge and past experience to a far greater extent than strongly narrativized texts. Now, the concept of presence, as I'm working with it, has roots primarily in philosophy of mind and cognitive linguistics, and its potential utility for narrative theory has really only begun to be tapped. Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht, a literary theorist at Stanford, writing on presence in the early 2000s, argues that what is present to us is in front of us. It's in reach and tangible for our bodies. So presence effects, for Gumbrecht, utilize the reader's embodied knowledge and past experience to a considerable extent. But Gumbrecht and I disagree on a major point. He says that literary texts are always primarily meaning-based, while visual art, for instance, is capable of exhibiting strong presence effects. Enter Agnieszka Kuzmakova, a narrative theorist at Stockholm University, who argues that language's capacity to make absent phenomena present to the senses, while often overlooked, is vital when considering language as an aesthetic experience. So more recently, presence is edging back into the equation of literary aesthetics. And for the philosopher Alvin Noé, presence is availability. It is achieved. It says we achieve access to the world around us through skillful engagement. We acquire and deploy the skills needed to bring the world into focus. So in order for presence, or direct perception of the world around us, to be achieved, it takes effort. It takes skillful engagement. And literary texts, too, require a set of skills in order to be brought into focus. And again, we're brought up learning to understand meaning effects, to look for and recognize meaning in a text. And when that primary mode of engagement fails us, though, we need to cultivate new skills, recognize new modes of engagement. So where does all this ruminating on weak narrativity and presence leave the reader? Reading texts with weak narrativity presents the reader with having to break free of a sort of functional fixedness, which is a cognitive bias marked by a tendency to utilize only the typical use of an object. In this case, that object is language. The basis of functional fixedness is that previous experience can actually have a profoundly negative impact on one's problem-solving abilities. So here, I suggest that thinking of narrative and language more generally strictly as a communicative tool just vastly limits one's experiential analysis of many texts and renders most weak narratives somewhat puzzling. Overcoming this functional fixedness requires the reader being open to an exploration rather than a transaction, to what I'm calling reading for presence. Which brings us to the case study that I'll be examining here, Lydia Davis's 2011 story, The Cows. I'm considering Davis's piece alongside other relatively plotless narratives, which is to say, nothing of note happens over the course of the story. There's no conflict, no real plot arc. The plot of the story, what happens or doesn't happen, isn't the point. That's not what engages the reader. Davis's take on plotlessness is, so far as I can tell, rather unique. Critics tend to ascribe kind of armchair philosophical points about the little things in life to plotless novels. This is perhaps most regularly seen in Nichols and Baker's The Mezzanine, which is a 130-page account of a man heading up an escalator to his office after an uneventful lunch break. But Davis pushes against this. Her 30-page observation of the cows living across the way from her upstate New York home, complete with photographs taken by the author and her son, does not delve much into the philosophical, though she does play with readers' expectations of it. She notes that the cows, their attention is complete as they look across the road. They're still and face us. Just because they're so still, their attitude seems philosophical. Now, the relative absence of a firm plot seems to naturally invite readers to imbue with meaning an otherwise boring story. Again, this is just what we're trained to do. But Davis challenges us to go beyond this, both here and elsewhere. The cow's attitude isn't philosophical, it just seems philosophical. They're just cows. I don't know any cows that are philosophical. So what else is there? The presence thesis that I'm setting forth gives us that something else. It gives us a different view of the project at hand. I've suggested that weak narrativity texts, such as Davis's, require of the reader a greater degree of their own embodied experience, expectation, and knowledge to be brought to bear on the text. And by subverting the expectations that one has of the typical narrative, by refusing to do what a narrative should do, that is, privileging meaning effects, making some sort of overarching point, telling a deeper story about the cows, the reader is forced to engage with the text in some other manner. So here, I'll discuss how kinesic description, or descriptions of bodily movements, serves as a presence affordance and allows for this relatively uneventful story world to open up. So again, I'm examining how traces of first-person experience, of embodied knowledge, tied to something as simple as reading descriptions or seeing images of movement, can afford a sense of presence in a story world. And I stress that this enactment of presence that stands out so strongly in weak narrativity texts is not just a mere textual representation. What the cows offers a reader is not a representation of Lydia Davis standing by a fence in a field watching some cows, but by heavily emphasizing presence affordances, such as the examples of kinesic description that we see here across pages 12 and 13, the story world is able to be, in a sense, explored. We're hardly given a lengthy description of the cows moving, but what we do have affords a sense of presence due to our proprioception, or the non-observational awareness of the body in action. So language here is being used to move, not to mean. And as such, the embodied reader is implicated in the experience of this scene, enacting the imagined presence of the cows in the field from a first-person perspective. And that is to say, it's the reader's own embodied experience, not a linguistic representation, which enacts this view of the cows, described on page 12, as seen over a hedge only about 3 feet long. A further spatial description here, too, serves as an additional presence affordance. Davis writes, "If I hold my arms straight out in front of me, the field of my vision in which they're grazing is only half the length of a finger. Yet that field of vision contains a part of their grazing field that is hundreds of square feet in area." Proprioception allows us to not only understand what Davis means here, but also to be intimately aware, due to our own kinesic intelligence, our knowledge of what it's like to move, of what the experience described here is like. And it's important to note that it's not only the kinesic descriptions of a human narrator that afford presence. Here, much of the kinesic description is attached to the cows. In a somewhat extended observation of the forelegs and the hind legs, we're given perhaps the most intensely focused kinesic detail, embedded within a fairly familiar concept, gracefulness. Gracefulness is very familiar to me, being the epitome of grace. Of course. So Davis writes, "The forelegs are more graceful than the back legs because they lift in a curve, whereas the back legs lift in a jagged line like a bolt of lightning. But perhaps the back legs, while less graceful than the forelegs, are more elegant. It is because of the way the joints in the leg work. Whereas the 2 lower joints of the front leg bend the same way, so that the front leg, as it is raised, forms a curve, the 2 lower joints in the back leg bend in opposite directions, so that the leg, when raised, forms 2 opposite angles, the lower one gentle, pointing forward, the upper one sharp, pointing back." Now, it's not entirely surprising, actually, in reading this passage, some muscular tension is felt. For as readers having the kinesic knowledge of our own limbs, our own proprioceptive tendencies, and a familiarity of the concepts of elegance and gracefulness, this allows this passage to serve as an affordance for presence, for being there in this field. Embedded, as it is, amidst pictures of the cows in various states of movement, either standing or with some implied movement, or something of an action shot with the 2 fellows on the edges there. This encourages not just a third-person mental representation. We're not seeing this in any kind of theater of the mind. But this is a first-person imagined enactment. We're there, in which the reader is far from a passive bystander. Now, the feeling of presence that this story affords, the sense of being there, watching the cows leaning on a fence, standing in the snow, this is due in no small part to the fact that very little else is going on. The story really is just about standing in one's yard, watching some cows on a neighboring property. So I'll leave you with these last 2 quotes, which tend to stick out whenever I read the cows, which is kind of uncomfortably often these days. "They come out from behind the barn as though something is going to happen, and then nothing happens." He says to us they don't really do anything. And then he says, but of course, there's not a lot for them to do. So today, I hope to have shown that reading for presence A, is a thing, it's a viable mode of reading, and B, that it provides a satisfying experience of the curiously told Lydia Davis narratives discussed here. So here, and in the longer project, I argue that the meaningful disturbances of Davis and other contemporary authors dabbling with the creative potential of weak narrativity are meant to get the reader to move past, for instance, what the cows could mean, or what Davis is trying to communicate, and instead to pick up on the various affordances through kinesic description here and other forms of embodied knowledge for feeling present in the story world. And if this is indeed the case, it's my hope that this approach provides a fresh look into the subversive, the strange, and the glorious exceptions to the rules. Thank you.